My scanner beeped twice, low and quiet, the kind of sound only I seemed to notice anymore. The cargo pod sitting in the docking queue was labeled as grain shipments, plain and boring, the sort of thing nobody looks at twice during a summit this important. But the mass reading on my scanner did not match the label stamped across the crate. Grain does not weigh like that. Grain does not sit that still on a gravity plate either. I raised a hand and asked the dock officer to hold the pod for a manual check. Nobody held anything. The Threxy guard standing beside me, a wall of gray armor plating named Kalik Dorn, laughed before I even finished the sentence. His laugh sounded like gravel falling down a metal chute, and he did that often, mostly at me. The little scanner brought its little human, he said to the dock officer, not to me, as if I were a broken tool instead of a soldier doing his job. Grain does not shoot back, Voss. Go stand somewhere useful. I did not argue. Arguing with someone who has already decided not to listen only wastes breath a person might need later. I stepped back and let the pod through, then filed the reading away in my own memory instead of the station log, because memory does not get erased by someone who outranks you. This was the job. Meridian Point, a relay station built on empty space and old treaties, was hosting the most important defense summit the Concord had held in years. 12 border worlds were being asked to bind themselves to one shared defense pact, trading a measure of their independence for a promise that none of them would face the Skarn Dominion alone. My task inside all of that was simple: keep one woman alive through it. Everything else, including my own pride, came second. Humanity was still new to this part of the galaxy, new enough that our reputation as soldiers was worth less than our reputation as farmers or engineers. Every other delegation at this summit had brought expensive, decorated security details with insignia and long service records. My employer had brought me because I came cheap. Cheap enough that nobody expected the newest species in the Concord to deserve anything better. I did not mind being cheap. I minded being wrong about that cargo pod and nobody caring enough to check. Meridian Point's docking bay stretched wide enough to swallow 40 ships at once. All steel ribs and humming gravity plates, loud with the constant traffic of a summit that had drawn delegations from every border world within 3 jumps. I had walked that bay a dozen times since arriving, not because anyone had asked me to, but because a person who wants to notice when something changes needs to know what normal looks like first. Normal, on a station like this, meant supply pods moving through on schedule, manifests matching cargo, nothing sitting heavier or lighter than the paperwork claimed. That grain pod had broken the pattern in a way small enough for most scanners to miss, and large enough that mine had not. Ambassador Selin Ovren arrived 20 minutes later, moving through the docking concourse with the calm, unhurried grace of someone who had spent decades in rooms where one wrong word could start a war. She led the Concord delegation trying to bind those 12 frightened border worlds together before the Skarn Dominion decided that fear alone was worth exploiting. It was a good plan. It also made her the single most valuable target on this station. She glanced at me once as she passed, a brief, assessing look, and said nothing. I appreciated that. Most people either ignored me completely or asked why a human was standing in a security line meant for professionals. She did neither. She simply looked, filed something away, and kept walking. Kalik Dorn fell into step beside her, with his chest out and his voice louder than it needed to be, listing off the Threxy Vanguard's credentials as if she had not already read every line of them in the contract. 60 years of service, 40 campaigns, 0 client losses. He said all of this while walking past me like I was part of the floor plating. I let him talk. He was not wrong about his record. He was only wrong about what mine was worth, because he had never once bothered to ask. The truth was simple enough, if anyone had cared to hear it. I used to be a soldier, the kind that does not get mentioned in press releases, and then I stopped being one. After that, I needed quiet work that paid enough to eat and did not ask questions about my file. Bodyguard contracts fit that description perfectly. Nobody digs into the past of the cheap hire. They just tell him where to stand. We escorted the ambassador through 3 checkpoints and into the summit's central hall, a wide chamber ringed with viewing windows that looked out over black space and a slow scatter of docked ships. Delegates from a dozen species filled the room, each one flanked by security that looked sharper and more expensive than mine. I noted every exit anyway, out of habit, and every place a person could hide a weapon, out of the same habit. Old training does not leave just because a person wants it to. I catalogued the room the way I catalogued every room I was paid to stand in. 2 Threxy guards by the northern entrance, armed with weapons built for a species notably stronger than a human, their eyes moving in wide, lazy sweeps that covered the room without ever quite settling anywhere long enough to notice details. A cluster of aides near the refreshment table, none of them armed, all of them tired in the specific way junior staff get tired during a long diplomatic season. A row of tall windows behind the podium that any decent marksman would have flagged as a liability on the first day of planning, and that nobody on the Threxy security team had mentioned once in 4 days. Nathaniel Cross found me near the east doorway an hour into the reception. He ran station security for Meridian Point, a tired-looking man with a datapad permanently welded to one hand and the particular patience of someone who had dealt with visiting delegations for a decade too long. "You flagged a cargo pod this morning," he said, not quite a question. Mass reading was off. Grain doesn't sit like that. Docking control cleared it, said the discrepancy was inside tolerance. It wasn't. He studied me for a moment, the way people do when they are deciding whether someone is being difficult or being careful. Most people cannot tell the difference. "I'll have someone look at it after the reception," he said finally. "After is fine," I said, "as long as it happens." He nodded and moved off toward another problem, because there is always another problem on a station this size, hosting a summit this important. I watched him go and filed away one small fact. He had listened. Not everyone did. The reception ran long, full of careful speeches about unity and shared defense. The kind of language diplomats use when they mean we are frightened and need each other but cannot say so directly. I stood near the ambassador and watched the room instead of the speakers, because threats rarely announce themselves from a podium. Kalik Dorn spent most of the evening near the drink service, telling stories to anyone who would listen. At one point, he gestured toward me while describing a battle from decades ago, using me as the punchline to a joke about weak allies who needed charity to feel safe. The delegates around him laughed politely, the way people laugh at a superior's joke rather than a funny one. I did not react. Reacting is what people expect from someone they are trying to provoke, and giving people what they expect rarely helps you later. Later that same hour, one of Kalik Dorn's soldiers made a show of testing my sidearm's weight in front of a cluster of aides, turning it over in an armored hand built to crush stone, remarking loudly that Concord regulations must have grown desperate indeed to arm their newest members with children's tools. I let him hand it back to me without comment, checked the safety out of habit rather than suspicion, and returned to my post. A weapon that works does not need anyone's approval, and neither, as it turned out, did I. Overin caught my eye across the room during that joke. She did not laugh. She held my gaze for a second longer than politeness required, then turned back to the delegate she had been speaking with, and I understood that she had noticed the difference between how the room saw me and how I actually stood inside it. Near the end of the evening, a runner from docking control found Cross with an update, and Cross relayed it to me on his way past, low enough that only I would hear it. The manual inspection of the grain pod had been delayed until morning, folded into a backlog of routine checks that came with hosting 60 ships at once. "Nothing urgent," he said, "just a scheduling matter." I told him that was fine. I did not think it was fine. A discrepancy in a security scan, tied to a summit this important, is not a scheduling matter, not in my experience, and my experience had cost me more than most people would want to pay to earn it. but pushing harder tonight would only prove Kalik Dorn's point about nervous, paranoid humans, and Overen's safety depended partly on this alliance holding together without visible cracks between its own security teams. So I let it wait until morning, the way everyone wanted, and stood my post at the ambassador's door long after the reception ended and the halls went quiet. Meridian Point settled into its night cycle, dimming its concourse lights, running its ships through automated docking checks, carrying on as though nothing about that pod's wait had ever bothered anyone at all. I stayed awake anyway. I always did. Sleep had never come easy since a place I did not let myself think about by name. And by now, I had stopped fighting that fact and simply used the extra hours instead, walking corridors, checking exits, memorizing the layout of a station I had only been assigned to for 4 days. Somewhere in that quiet, careful work, I told myself the grain pod was nothing. A shipping error. A miscalibrated scale. I did not believe myself, not even a little. And some part of me that had survived worse places than this one kept circling back to that reading long after everyone else had stopped thinking about it at all. 12 border worlds were counting on this summit going smoothly. An ambassador who had noticed more about me in one glance than most people managed in a year was trusting a stranger with her life. And somewhere in Dock 4, a crate that was not grain sat quietly in the dark, waiting for morning. I did not know yet how little time morning would actually give us. I only knew, standing in that darkened corridor, that the feeling in my chest was one I recognized, and I had never once been wrong about it before. The device came apart from a serving tray, not a weapon rack, which is exactly why nobody else saw it coming. The private corridor ran between the delegate quarters and the session hall, narrow enough that security details from a dozen species had to file through in careful order, wide enough that nobody had thought twice about letting catering staff move through it during the changeover between sessions. It was the kind of gap in a routine that exists on every station, in every summit, because routines cannot account for every possible danger without grinding to a halt entirely. Someone had studied that gap carefully enough to know exactly which morning to use it. We were 3 steps into the morning session, the ambassador walking between 2 Threxy guards and myself through a private corridor reserved for delegates, when a serving attendant reached across a drink cart and left something small and dark clipped to the underside of the table beside Overen's seat. I caught the motion in the corner of my eye, wrong in a way I could not immediately name, and I was moving before I finished naming it. I do not remember deciding to cross the room. I remember being on the other side of it, one hand closing over the device before it finished arming, the attendant already down and pinned beneath my knee, the ambassador 3 steps back with Kalik Dorn's arm only half raised in a defense that would have arrived a full second too late. The device turned out to be small enough to fit inside a closed fist, built to disable rather than destroy, the kind of tool used when someone wants a person removed from a room quietly instead of loudly. It would have taken Overen out of the summit permanently, and very likely out of her own life, without ever announcing an attacker had been in the room at all. Station security arrived in under a minute, which is a good response time and also entirely useless, because the moment that mattered had already closed by the time anyone else walked through the door. Kalik Dorn recovered his composure fast. By the time Nathaniel Cross finished taking statements, the story circulating through the corridor was already shifting shape, the way stories do when someone with a louder voice decides how they should be told. The Threxy Vanguard, I heard one delegate say within the hour, had prevented an attempt on the ambassador's life. I did not correct him. Correcting him would have meant explaining exactly how close Overen had come to dying under Threxy protection, and that was not a conversation anyone in that hallway wanted out loud, least of all the delegation footing Kalik Dorn's bill. The attendant, once questioned, turned out to be exactly what I expected. A local contractor, hired through 3 layers of shell paperwork, paid in currency that traced back to nothing useful. Whoever wanted Overen gone had been careful enough to leave no thread worth pulling. That kind of care told me more than the attempt itself. Amateurs leave threads. Someone patient had built this one. Cross ran the man's biometric data against every registry Meridian Point had access to and came back with nothing that closed the case. Only more questions about who had the resources to erase a hired hand this cleanly. I did not find that reassuring. Careful enemies are worse than desperate ones, because desperate enemies eventually make a mistake large enough to see coming, and careful enemies simply wait for the next opportunity instead. Overin found me an hour later, alone, in the narrow observation gallery above the summit hall where I had gone to watch the room from a different angle. She moved quietly, for someone whose species was not naturally built for quiet movement, and I only noticed her when she was already standing beside me at the railing. "You did not correct the captain's account," she said. "Didn't seem worth the argument." "It would matter to me if I were you. You're not me." She almost smiled at that, the expression flickering at the corner of her mouth before she put it away again, the way diplomats learn to put away everything that might be used against them later. "I have read every file in your contract twice," she said. "There is very little in it. A service record with most of its detail removed, a gap of several years with no listed employer, a discharge with no listed reason. Redacted files are common in my line of work." "They are common when someone wants them to be common," she said, "not when the truth underneath is ordinary." I did not answer that, because there was no good answer that would not open a door I had spent years keeping shut. She watched me for a moment longer, then let the silence stand instead of pushing through it, which told me more about her than most of what she had already said aloud. She was patient in a way that respected the shape of another person's limits, a rare enough trait among people whose job depended on getting others to talk. "Thank you," she said instead, simply, "for the tray. That's the job." "It is not, actually. The job would have been standing where you were told to stand. What you did was notice something nobody else in that hallway was paid to notice." She turned from the railing before I could decide how to answer that either. "I would like to know your name properly someday, Mr. Voss, not the version in the file." "There isn't much to know," I said. "I stand where I'm told, and I notice things other people miss. That's the whole file, whether or not it says so in writing. I have negotiated with liars for most of my career," she said. "I know the sound of a rehearsed answer, and that was one. I do not need the truth today. I suspect I will need it eventually, and I would rather you offer it than have it found for me." She left before I had to promise her anything, which I appreciated more than I told her. Kalik Dorn intercepted me at the gallery entrance not long after Overin left, blocking the doorway with the particular stance of someone who had rehearsed what he wanted to say. "You embarrassed my unit this morning," he said, low enough that only I would hear it, and I understood that the accusation mattered more to him privately than it ever would in public. A guest security contractor should not be faster to a threat than the professionals hired to stop it. I told him I had not been trying to embarrass anyone, only trying to keep the ambassador breathing, and he studied me for a long moment before stepping aside without another word, which was the closest thing to doubt I had seen cross his face since the day we met. I stayed in the gallery a while longer, watching the summit hall below refill with delegates who had already half forgotten the morning's near miss, because near misses that never become headlines rarely change anyone's schedule. Kalik Dorn stood near the entrance again, telling a slightly larger story to a slightly larger audience, and I let that happen too, because pride is not a hill worth dying on when there are actual hills still ahead of us. Grace Ellery found me there instead, climbing the gallery stairs 2 steps at a time with the particular urgency of someone who had been told to hurry and had taken the instructions seriously. She ran sensor operations for the station, young enough that this posting was likely her first real assignment away from a training deck, and good enough at her job that Cross trusted her with things he did not hand to more senior staff. "Cross wants you," she said, slightly out of breath. "Both of you, actually, but he told me to find you first." "Why me first?" "Because you're the one who flagged the cargo pod yesterday, and he thinks that matters now." We found Cross in the security office 2 decks down, a cramped room full of screens showing feeds from every corridor on the station. none of them showing anything that explained the tension sitting in his shoulders. He waved me toward a console displaying a long-range sensor sweep, the kind of display that meant nothing to most visitors and meant everything to anyone who had spent time reading them. "Border Patrol picked up drive signatures 4 hours ago," he said. "Skarn configuration, moving in tight formation, on a heading that puts them at Meridian Point inside 2 days if they hold course." "Patrol route?" "Patrol routes don't move in formation, Voss. Patrol routes don't hide their transponders either." He tapped the screen, pulling up a second image, fainter, a cluster of returns half-masked by sensor noise, deliberately so. "This is a strike group. I've studied enough Dominion movement patterns over the years to know one when it's staring back at me." Ellery pulled up a third overlay, comparing the fleet spacing against known Skarn tactical doctrine, her hands moving fast across the console in a way that told me she had already run this comparison more than once before bringing it to Cross. "The spacing matches a boarding formation, not a bombardment formation," she said. "Whatever they are planning, it isn't leveling the station from orbit. It's getting soldiers onto it, quietly, before anyone else even knows they're close enough to matter." "How many ships?" I asked. 12 confirmed, possibly more hiding in the lead formation's sensor shadow. If this is a full strike group and not just an advance element, we could be looking at several hundred soldiers once they're all aboard, assuming they intend to board rather than simply bombard once the boarding parties finish their work. Ellery pulled the numbers up on a side display, and none of them made the room feel any warmer. "Dominion doctrine usually pairs an assault force with a secondary wave held in reserve, in case the first wave doesn't finish the job cleanly." "It rarely does," I said, before I could stop myself, and both of them looked at me a beat too long for comfort. I let the sentence sit there rather than explain it, because explaining it meant a conversation I did not have time for yet. The room went quiet for a moment while that settled. A bombardment was a threat you could see coming and shoot at from a distance, something a station's defense grid was built to answer. A boarding formation was a threat that walked through your front door wearing a friendly face until the last possible second, which sounded uncomfortably familiar to a man who had just watched a serving attendant plant a device under a drink tray that same morning. "The grain pod," I said. Cross looked up sharply. "You think they're connected? I think a boarding force needs a way inside that doesn't trip an alarm before it's ready to. A cargo pod with a mass reading that doesn't match its manifest is exactly that kind of way in, if nobody bothers to check it in time." "It's still sitting in Dock 4, Ellery said. "The manual inspection got pushed to this afternoon." "Push it to now." Cross was already moving before I finished the sentence, keying a channel to docking control with the flat, controlled urgency of a man who had spent an entire career hoping never to need this particular tone of voice. I stood at his shoulder and watched the long-range plot update in real time, the Skarn formation crawling closer across a display that measured distance in hours instead of miles, and felt something old and familiar settle into my chest, a weight I recognized the way a person recognizes an old injury flaring up in cold weather. I had felt this exact stillness before, the kind that arrives right before everything gets loud, and the last time I felt it, most of the people standing beside me did not live to feel anything again. I did not say that out loud. Ellery and Cross had enough to worry about without hearing where my calm came from, and some debts are not paid by frightening people who cannot do anything about the past that earned them. "How long until that fleet is inside weapons range?" I asked instead. Cross read the numbers off the screen, and neither of us liked the answer. 30 hours, he said. "Maybe less, if they stop holding back their speed to avoid detection." "And the summit's closing session?" "Scheduled for tomorrow evening. Every delegate on this station, all 12 worlds, signing in the same room at the same time." Cross set the datapad down slowly, the way a person sets something down when they finally understand its full weight. "If someone wanted every border world's leadership vulnerable at once, that's the exact hour they would choose to strike. 12 worlds, all in one room, at the exact hour their combined signatures would bind them into something stronger than any of them could manage alone." I understood, standing in that cramped office, exactly why someone patient enough to hire a contractor through 3 layers of shell paperwork would also be patient enough to time an invasion around a single closing ceremony instead of striking earlier, when scattering the delegates would have cost the attacker nothing but urgency. Ellery had gone pale beneath the console lighting, though her hands stayed steady on the controls, a sign she was better under pressure than her age suggested. "Should we move the closing session?" she asked. "Change the schedule, scatter the delegates." "You could," I said, "and every delegation captain on this station would call it panic and refuse to move. 12 worlds agreeing to change a summit schedule on short notice is harder than getting them to agree to the pact itself. Then what do we do?" I looked at the plot again, at the slow crawl of drive signatures closing the distance 1 careful hour at a time, and thought about a grain pod sitting quietly in Dock 4 with a mass reading that had never once made sense. "We open that crate," I said, "before it decides to open itself." Cross was already halfway to the door, and for the first time since I had arrived on Meridian Point, nobody in that room was laughing at the cheap human security contractor standing in the corner. The crate split open before the inspection team even finished attaching their cutting tool to its casing, and the first thing that came out of it was not grain. I was 3 steps behind Cross when the seal blew from the inside, a controlled charge rather than an accident, and the panel that had been holding steady under gravity plates for 2 days folded outward like it had never been solid at all. What came through the gap was compact, armored, and moving before the smoke cleared, 3 Skarn soldiers unfolding from a storage configuration that should not have fit a single grown adult, let alone 3 of them. They moved with the eerie economy of soldiers who had rehearsed this exact unfolding 100 times in a training yard somewhere far from here, weapons already raised before their boots fully cleared the crate's shattered edge, covering 3 separate angles of the dock without a single wasted motion between them. Cross went down first, caught across the shoulder by a stun round meant to remove him from the fight without wasting a kill shot on someone who was not the priority target. I had him by the collar and behind a support pillar before the second round found the space where he had been standing, and by then the alarm klaxons were already screaming through every deck of Meridian Point, because whatever else that boarding party wanted quiet, the moment of arrival was never meant to stay hidden for long. "Station lockdown, all sections," the automated voice repeated overhead, flat and calm, in the way machines are calm during exactly the moments people are not. "This is not a drill." I did not need the machine to tell me that. 3 Skarn soldiers from 1 crate meant the crate had never been the whole plan. It was a key, not an army, something built to crack the lock on Dock 4 from the inside and hold the door open just long enough for whatever was actually coming to arrive. I got Cross moving toward the security office with one arm looped under his good shoulder, both of us half running through a corridor that had gone from routine to war in the space of one indrawn breath, and behind us I heard the docking clamps on Bay 4 release their emergency seals, one after another, in a rhythm too even to be anything but deliberate. Something much larger than a crate was coming through that opening now. I caught one glimpse of it over my shoulder before the corridor bent away from the dock, a shape too large for a shuttle and too quiet for anything running a conventional drive, easing through the breach the way something moves when it has done this before and expects no serious resistance waiting on the other side. Kalik Dorn met us at the junction outside the security office, already armored and already loud, the kind of loud that comes from confidence rather than fear. "Raiders," he said, like the word settled something. "A boarding attempt, nothing more. The Vanguard has broken worse than this before breakfast." "It's not raiders," I said. "It's an opening move." He did not have time to argue the point, because that was the moment the first wave came through the breach in numbers large enough to answer the question for both of us. Skarn soldiers in matched armor filled the far end of the corridor in a formation too disciplined to belong to opportunists looking for an easy score, moving with the kind of coordinated silence that only comes from extensive drilling against exactly this scenario, boarding a hostile structure and holding ground inside it. The Threxy vanguard met them head-on, and for the first few exchanges, they held. Kalik Dorn's people fought the way their reputation promised, armor plating shrugging off rounds that would have dropped a lesser force, heavy weapons answering the boarding party's advance with enough force to buy the corridor another minute. For those first exchanges, I let myself believe Kalik Dorn's confidence might actually be earned. Threxy armor turned aside rounds that would have gone straight through a human chest, and their return fire dropped attackers in numbers that should have ended any ordinary raid within minutes. But this was not an ordinary raid, and the Skarn kept coming in disciplined waves rather than a single committed rush, the kind of attack built by a commander willing to trade soldiers for ground one, measured step at a time. I used that minute to get Cross fully into the security office and Ellery away from the exposed console she had been working at, both of them protesting that there was still work to do, both of them wrong about how much time remained to do it in. "Where's the ambassador?" I asked Cross the moment he had breath enough to answer. "Committee chamber, second floor of the summit hall. Full delegate session. They were reviewing the pact language when the alarm hit. Every delegate on the station, in one room, exactly as the schedule promised, and exactly as I had told Ellery only an hour before that no one would agree to change." I left Cross with Ellery and two of the office's own security staff, all of them armed, all of them frightened, in the specific quiet way of people who train for emergencies and then discover the emergency has actually arrived, and I went for the summit hall at a dead run. Behind me, though I would not learn the details until much later, Cross's small team held their own line at the security office doorway, driving off a probing attack aimed at seizing the station's internal sensor grid before it could track the boarding party's movement. Ellery kept the long-range plot running the entire time, one hand resting on a sidearm she had never before needed to draw outside a training range, because someone still needed to watch the fleet, even while the fleet's soldiers were already inside the walls. The corridors leading toward the summit hall were already a mess of fleeing staff and confused delegates' aides, most of them running in whatever direction looked emptiest, rather than any direction that actually led somewhere safe. I moved against that current, reading the flow of frightened bodies the way another person might read a map, because panic tends to run away from danger in fairly predictable directions, and predictable is useful when a person needs to find where the danger actually is. I passed two aides helping a wounded delegate from a species I did not recognize toward what I hoped was a genuine evacuation route, and a station engineer sealing a bulkhead behind a cluster of dock workers with hands that shook only slightly despite the noise coming from every direction at once. Nobody stopped me to ask why a human security contractor was running toward the fighting instead of away from it. There was no time left, on either side of that question, for anyone to wonder. I found it 2 corridors short of the summit hall, where a second Skarn detachment had already secured a side entrance and was holding position rather than advancing, meaning something worse than a simple assault was underway. They were waiting for a signal. Somewhere close, someone was coordinating this, instead of simply throwing soldiers at the nearest open door. I took the long way around, through a maintenance corridor most delegates never knew existed, one of the dozen routes I had memorized on my first night aboard the station, out of habit, rather than any expectation I would need them within the week. For a few seconds, running through a passage lit only by emergency strips, I was somewhere else entirely. A narrow tunnel lit by lights meant for mining equipment rather than soldiers, listening to a countdown someone else was calling over a comm channel while the ground shook with a controlled collapse a long way behind me. I let the memory pass through without stopping to stand inside it, because Karan had taught me that dwelling on old ground gets people killed on new ground, and there was still a room full of delegates ahead of me that needed exactly the version of myself running through this corridor now, not the version still grieving in a tunnel that had closed itself over a decade ago. The maintenance route brought me out behind the summit hall's north entrance, close enough to hear Kalik Dorn's voice through the chamber doors, still fighting, still holding, though with noticeably less confidence in it than an hour before. Inside, the committee chamber had become a choke point. Delegates and aides from all 12 border worlds were pressed against the far wall behind an overturned conference table, while what remained of the Threxy vanguard held the entrance against a Skarn advance that showed no sign of slowing. Overin stood near the center of the huddled delegation, calm in a way that looked deliberate rather than natural. The kind of calm a leader chooses to project because everyone around her needs to see it, even when she does not feel it herself. I came in through a side access panel instead of the main doors, which meant nobody shot at me on the way in. A small mercy I intended to make full use of. "Voss," Overin said, and something in her voice loosened slightly at the sight of me, though her composure never fully cracked. "Cross said you were headed for the office. Change of plan. This looked like the more important room." Kalik Dorn fell back a step from the doorway, blood running from a cut along his jaw, where a round had grazed the edge of his helmet, his armor scarred in a dozen places that had not been scarred that morning. "We are holding," he said, though the sentence cost him something to say, an admission that holding was no longer quite the same as winning. "For now," I said. "How many effectives do you have left?" 11. 4 wounded beyond continued fighting. 11 Threxy soldiers, against a force that had already committed at least 2 separate detachments and clearly had more behind them, defending a room holding every delegate whose signature mattered to the entire pact. The math was not good, and getting worse with every minute the boarding party spent probing for a weakness instead of simply overwhelming the doorway outright, a sign they wanted the room intact rather than destroyed. Someone on the other side of this attack wanted delegates alive, at least for now, which was either good news or far worse news depending on what came next. I watched Kalik Dorn's remaining soldiers reposition without needing to be told twice, veterans enough to read the shape of a losing fight and adjust before pride cost them a formation they could not afford to lose. Whatever else I thought of the captain's mouth, his people fought like professionals, disciplined even as the numbers turned against them, and I filed that fact away alongside everything else worth remembering about this day. Another wave hit the entrance while I was still working out the answer to that question, and I watched 2 of Kalik Dorn's soldiers fall in the same exchange, one of them a soldier named Rethka who had spent the first night of the summit trading jokes with the dock crews over rationed drinks. The other, a quieter soldier named Vol, who had barely said a dozen words to me across the entire assignment. Neither of them stood back up, and the corridor got a little quieter, one voice at a time, with every wave that came through. I spent that stretch of fighting doing what I could without stepping fully into it, dragging 2 wounded aides clear of the doorway's kill zone, redirecting a support column's emergency lighting to blind an attacker's optics for the half-second Kalik Dorn needed to finish him. Small things that looked like luck to anyone who was not looking closely enough to see a pattern in them. I was not ready yet to let anyone look that closely, not even Overin, watching me from across the chamber with an expression that had already started asking the question Kalik Dorn would eventually put into words. A runner from Ellery's console reached me through a side channel on my earpiece a few minutes later, her voice tight but steady. "Main sensor array just updated," she said. "The strike group we tracked yesterday isn't 30 hours out anymore. They changed course and burned hard the moment the boarding parties breached. Best estimate puts the main fleet at 4 hours, maybe less." 4 hours. Not a raid meant to grab a target and vanish before anyone could respond in force. An invasion, timed precisely to arrive once the summit's defenses were already committed to fighting the opening move. Exactly the kind of layered attack a patient, disciplined force builds when it has studied its target for a long time before ever showing itself. I relayed the number to Kalik Dorn, who took it the way a soldier takes news that changes the shape of a battle he thought he understood. His jaw tightened, and for the first time since I had met him, the bravado in his voice thinned down to something closer to honesty. 11 soldiers cannot hold this room for 4 hours against a fleet's worth of reinforcements, he said, quiet enough that only I could hear it clearly over the ongoing exchange of fire at the doorway. "No," I agreed. "They can't." Another wave hit the entrance while we spoke, harder than the last, and 2 more Threxy went down, one of them not getting back up. Kalik Dorn threw himself back into the gap they left, still fighting, still doing the only thing his training had ever taught him to do when a position needed holding, and I watched a man who had mocked me for 2 straight days give everything he had left to protect a room full of people who were not even his own species. I moved the delegates further back during the lull that followed, using the overturned table and a support column to build a second line the Skarn would need to fight through even if the doorway finally failed, walking over and personally to the most defensible corner the room offered, because some jobs do not get delegated regardless of how many other things also need doing at once. "You should be at that doorway," she said, watching me settle the last of the frightened aides into position. "That is where the fighting is. This is where the job is." She studied me for a moment, in the strange, flickering light of a chamber lit only by emergency systems, delegates behind her whispering in 6 languages, all of them asking versions of the same question nobody could yet answer. 4 hours, she said quietly, and 11 soldiers who cannot hold a doorway for one. "I know. Is there truly nothing else to be done, Mr. Voss? I have watched you since the first morning of this summit. I do not believe you are only what your contract says you are, and I do not believe this is the moment for either of us to keep pretending otherwise." I thought, in the space of that single held breath, about every reason I had built over the years for staying quiet, and about how none of those reasons had ever once accounted for a room full of people who were going to die in the next few hours if I kept keeping them. I did not answer right away, because answering meant opening a door I had spent a long time keeping shut, and some doors do not close again once a person finally lets them open. I thought of 31 names I still knew by heart, and 26 of them attached to people who were not alive to forgive me for whatever I chose to do next. I thought of delegates from 12 worlds who had never done anything to deserve dying in a committee chamber over a pact meant to keep exactly this kind of mourning from happening to anyone else. The arithmetic was not difficult, whatever it cost to finish it. Kalik Dorn staggered back from the entrance then, blood soaking through the plating along his side, and for the first time he was not shouting orders or boasting about decades of unbroken service. He looked instead like a man doing arithmetic he did not want to finish, counting soldiers he still had against a number that kept climbing on the other side of that doorway. He found me across the ruined chamber, past the huddled delegates and the smoke drifting from a scorched section of wall, and asked the question plainly, without any of the noise he usually wrapped around his words. "Voss," he said, "is there anything you can do?" The room went quiet enough, in the space between one exchange of fire and the next, that I believe every delegate, still standing, heard him ask it. "Yes," I said, and for the first time since arriving on Meridian Point, I let the word carry its full weight instead of folding it down into something smaller. I did not explain further. Explaining costs time, and time was the one thing that Doorway had stopped giving any of us the moment Kalik Dorn asked his question out loud. I crossed the chamber to the weapons crate the Threxy had abandoned near the entrance, taking a rifle built for hands larger than mine and adjusting nothing about it, because a tool works or it does not, and I had never needed one built to my exact measurements to make it work. "Get everyone behind the second line," I told Kalik Dorn. "It's all the way behind it. Whatever comes through that doorway next is mine." He looked at me for one long second, blood still running from the cut along his jaw, and something in his expression shifted from disbelief toward a question he did not have time to ask. Then he did what I told him, which was the first order he had taken from me since we met, and he did it without a single word of argument. The next wave came through the doorway 8 seconds later, and it came through expecting 11 wounded Threxy soldiers holding a failing line. It found something else instead. I do not remember that stretch of time the way I remember ordinary moments. In a clean, unbroken line, I remember it the way a person remembers a fall, in pieces, sharper in some places than others. I remember the doorway's narrow frame turning into an advantage instead of a weakness, because a corridor that only lets one attacker through at a time is a corridor a defender can hold against far greater numbers, provided the defender never lets a single one of them past before the next arrives. Partway through that stretch, I found the corridor's environmental control panel still active behind a service hatch, and used it exactly the way I had once used a ventilation shaft at Quran, venting the narrow approach with enough suppressant fog to blind anything relying on standard optics, while my own eyes had already adjusted to far worse conditions than fog. 2 more attackers went down in the confusion before the rest of that wave finally understood the doorway was not going to open the way their briefing had promised it would. Somewhere behind me, I heard one of the Border World delegates whisper a question to another in a language I did not know well enough to translate, though the tone needed no translation at all. Fear, mostly, and underneath it, the first thread of something that might eventually become disbelief. I remember the particular economy of movement that training builds into a person over years, until the body answers a threat before the mind finishes recognizing it, an old and unwelcome gift from a life I had tried very hard to leave behind at Quran. Quran. I let myself think the name for the first time in longer than I could count, standing in that doorway with a rifle that was not mine and a room full of frightened delegates behind me, because there was no use pretending anymore that this moment and that one were not built from the same material. I remembered a tunnel collapsing on command, timed to the second, because a young sergeant with a demolition specialty had realized the Skarn assault pattern would funnel 3 full companies through one narrow approach if the garrison simply refused to break formation and run. I remembered Captain Silas Bowen's voice on an open channel, steady even as the walls shook, telling his people to hold because holding was the only version of this fight that ended with anyone left alive to matter. I remembered Daniel Ashford beside me in the dark, laughing at something neither of us would have found funny anywhere else, because laughing was sometimes the only thing left that a person could still choose to do. I remembered that both of them died anyway, in the end, along with most of the rest of that garrison, buying a victory so complete that the Skarn Dominion had never once, in all the years since, spoken its name where I could hear it. I came back to the present with a Skarn soldier already falling in front of me, and 3 more behind him, learning, too late, that this doorway was no longer the easy path it had been a minute earlier. I held that ground the way I had once helped hold a tunnel, refusing every attempt to push past me, using the frame of the doorway the way Bowen had once used a mountain, turning the enemy's numbers into their own disadvantage, one narrow exchange at a time. Every attacker who came through that gap made the same mistake, trusting the doorway's narrow width to slow me down as much as it slowed them, forgetting that a defender who has stood this exact kind of ground before knows exactly how little space a person actually needs to end an exchange before it starts. I did not think about it as courage. It was closer to arithmetic, the same kind Bowen had taught a much younger version of me in a tunnel that no longer existed, where the only numbers that mattered were how many could fit through a gap at once, and how quickly that number could be brought back down to 1. Behind me, I heard Kalik Dorn's voice, quieter now, relaying updates to the huddled delegates in a tone that had lost every trace of the boasting he had carried since the day we met. I did not have room to listen closely. The doorway needed all of me, and for the length of that fight, it got all of me. The version of myself I had spent years trying to convince people did not exist anymore. The attack finally slowed, then stopped, the Skarn soldiers pulling back from a doorway that had stopped being worth the cost of taking it. In the sudden quiet that followed, I heard something crackle to life on a command channel that should not have been open to our side at all, a stolen frequency, or a deliberate one. A voice speaking Skarn military code with the flat authority of someone used to being obeyed instantly. "Identify the human," the voice said, translated a half-second later through the earpiece Cross had given me that morning. "Identify him now." I understood, in that pause, that whoever commanded this attack was not simply reviewing a battle report. He was watching, through some feed I could not see, and he had stopped the assault specifically to ask that question before deciding whether to send the next wave. Nobody in that chamber answered him, because nobody in that chamber except me actually could. For one held breath, I considered staying silent, letting the moment pass, retreating back into the anonymity that had protected me for years. But silence would only buy a pause before the next wave came, and a room full of delegates did not have hours to spend waiting on my comfort. I stepped fully into the doorway, where whatever camera or drone was carrying that feed could see me clearly, and I gave him the only answer that had ever mattered in a moment like this one. "Ethan Voss," I said. "Formerly attached to the Charon garrison. I imagine your records have a file on that, somewhere they don't like to open." The silence on the other end of that channel lasted longer than any silence has a right to last during an active engagement. Somewhere aboard the Skarn flagship holding position at the edge of the system, Fleet Marshal Draxus Vale heard that name over a translated feed and felt the floor of his own certainty give way beneath him. The bridge around him carried on with its ordinary business, officers relaying troop positions and damage estimates from the boarding parties still aboard Meridian Point, none of them yet aware that their commander had stopped listening to any of it. He had been a junior officer at Charon, decades younger and much less decorated, assigned to a battalion that outnumbered its target garrison by a margin considered so overwhelming that the operation had been expected to conclude within a single day. He remembered the mountain the garrison had turned into a killing ground. He remembered a tunnel collapse that had taken an entire company with it in the space of one indrawn breath. He remembered most of all a name that had circulated afterward among the handful of survivors in whispers rather than reports, because the Dominion's high command had decided, in the aftermath, that a defeat of that size was easier to erase from the record than to explain to a public that had been promised an easy victory. He remembered, too, the specific silence that had fallen over his own command deck when the final casualty reports came in. Senior officers who had promised their superiors an afternoon's work, standing instead in front of numbers that read like a different kind of battle entirely. He had been 23 years old, newly commissioned, watching men and women twice his age try to explain to Dominion Command why a garrison of 31 had cost them a battalion, and finding no explanation that made the number easier to hear. Voss. Vale pulled the old file the moment the name reached him, a file so deeply buried that accessing it required an authorization code he had not used in years, and found exactly what the cold weight in his chest had already told him he would find. A garrison of 31 soldiers, a battalion of over 400 sent to remove them, a final casualty count that had ended careers and closed investigations rather than ever being spoken aloud in a Dominion briefing room again. And one name, flagged in the survivor debriefs as the soldier responsible for the tactics that broke that battalion apart from the inside. Commander Osuk, his second on the flagship's bridge, argued longest against the order to withdraw. "It is one man in one doorway, Marshal," Osuk said. "Whatever happened decades ago does not change what 400 soldiers can accomplish against a station this size, if we commit fully instead of testing the water one wave at a time. One human, however skilled, however dangerous in a single doorway, was still one human, and the Dominion had committed an entire fleet to this operation on the promise of a fast, decisive result. Pulling back now, Osuk argued, would cost the Dominion more in standing among its own rival houses than pressing forward ever could. Whatever old history the name Voss happened to stir up in a commander who had survived Charon by accident of assignment rather than any particular skill of his own. Vale listened to every argument his officers raised, because a good commander always listens before he decides, and then he overruled every single one of them, including the one from a subordinate too young to have stood in that tunnel himself, and too proud yet to understand what it meant that his commander had. "You did not stand in that tunnel," he said, quiet enough that the bridge crew had to lean in to hear him over the hum of the ship's systems. "I did. I have spent every year since telling myself that Charon was an anomaly. a single unlucky battle that could never repeat itself. I will not spend the rest of my career discovering, in front of all of you, whether I was right. He did not raise his voice to make the point. He had learned, in the years since Quran, that the officers who shouted the loudest about acceptable risk were rarely the ones who had stood close enough to that risk to understand its actual cost. He gave the order to disengage before his officers finished their protests, recalling every boarding party still aboard Meridian Point, breaking the fleet's approach vector, and turning an entire invasion fleet's worth of momentum back toward the border they had crossed with such confidence only hours before. I did not know any of that until later, of course. What I knew, standing in that doorway with a borrowed rifle and a room full of delegates who had gone entirely silent behind me, was that the attack simply stopped. No further waves came through the breach. Ellery's voice reached me a few minutes afterward through the same channel Cross had given me, tight with disbelief rather than relief, because disbelief tends to arrive first in a person who has spent hours preparing for the opposite outcome. "They're pulling back," she said. "All of them. The strike group, the boarding parties, everything. They're breaking formation and running for the border." Kalik Dorn came to stand beside me at the doorway, looking out at a corridor that had gone quiet in a way it had not been quiet in hours, his armor scarred, and his voice, when it finally came, stripped down to something I had not heard from him before. "What did you say to them?" he asked. "My name," I said. Apparently, that was enough. He did not laugh at that, and for the first time since I had met him, I understood that he finally believed me. I did not feel triumphant standing there, though I understood, distantly, that triumph was probably the correct response to what had just happened. Mostly I felt tired in a way that had nothing to do with the last several hours of fighting, an old, familiar tiredness that had been waiting patiently under the surface since long before Meridian Point, finally given a reason to surface again. Around me, the delegates who had spent the last several hours pressed against a wall behind an overturned table were beginning, slowly, to believe that the sound of gunfire might actually be finished for good. Nobody cheered. Nobody spoke at all, for a long moment, as though the room itself needed time to confirm that silence could be trusted again before anyone risked breaking it. Ovren was the first to move, crossing the ruined chamber toward the doorway where I still stood, her expression unreadable in the way I had come to recognize as her working very hard to hold something together in front of people who needed her to. Ovren reached me before I had fully lowered the rifle, and behind her, the delegates were beginning to untangle themselves from the corner where I had packed them, though nobody in that chamber was ready yet to call the morning finished. A fleet capable of turning away that fast was also a fleet capable of turning back just as fast, and nobody aboard Meridian Point was willing to trust a retreat until long-range sensors confirmed it 3 separate times over the following hours. Ellery ran that confirmation from the security office, with Cross propped in a chair beside her, his shoulder wrapped tight against the stun round's damage, both of them watching a long-range plot that showed Skarn drive signatures shrinking steadily across a display that had shown them growing for the better part of 2 days. I stayed at the summit hall until the third confirmation came through, because Ovren's safety was still the job even after the fighting stopped, and jobs do not end simply because the hardest part of them is over. Word reached me partway through that wait that Ellery had taken a graze across the arm during the probing attack on the security office. Not severe, but enough that Cross had to physically stop her from returning to her console before the medical team finished dressing it. I did not breathe easily again until I heard her voice on the open channel herself, irritated at being fussed over rather than in any real pain, a better sign of her condition than any medical report could have given me. "Confirmed," Ellery finally said, her voice carrying through every open channel on the station at once. "Full withdrawal. They've crossed back over the border marker, and they are not slowing down." The sound that went through the summit chamber then was not cheering, not exactly. It was closer to an entire room remembering how to breathe at the same time. Delegates from 12 worlds, who had spent hours pressed against a wall behind an overturned table, finally allowing their shoulders to drop. Aides checking on each other in half a dozen languages, none of the words mattering as much as the tone underneath them. We lost 6 Threxy soldiers holding that doorway, and 3 station security staff elsewhere on Meridian Point, along with 2 of the dock workers who had been closest to the crate when it opened. Kalik Dorn read the names aloud himself, once the medical teams had finished their first pass through the wounded, standing very straight in armor still marked from the fighting, and for those few minutes, nobody in that chamber cared what species had done the dying. The cost had been shared, and he made certain everyone understood that, before he ever said another word about anything else. 2 of the fallen security staff were people I had shared a meal with in the station's cramped mess hall only 2 nights before, trading stories about nothing important, the way people do when they do not yet know how little time they have left to waste on small talk. I did not know either of them well enough to claim real grief, only the quieter, harder feeling of having stood close enough to loss, to recognize its shape without being able to do anything about it this time. I did not know, in that moment, that the story of what happened in that doorway had already started spreading through the station faster than any official report could catch up to it. Delegates talk, and aides talk faster, and by the time the medical teams finished their work, most of Meridian Point had heard some version of the truth, each one slightly different, all of them circling the same basic fact. The cheap human security contractor had stood in a doorway, set his name into an open channel, and an entire invasion fleet had turned around and gone home. The closing session convened 11 hours later than scheduled, in a chamber still bearing scorch marks along one wall that nobody had bothered covering, because covering them would have meant pretending the morning had not happened, and every delegate in that room had decided, independently, that pretending was no longer useful. The Defense Pact passed with a vote that would have taken weeks of careful negotiation under any ordinary circumstances. It took 40 minutes, because 12 border worlds had just watched exactly what waiting for a crisis to prove itself could cost, and none of them wanted to test that lesson twice. Ovren found me afterward on the same observation gallery where she had thanked me once already, standing at the same railing, looking down at a summit hall now filled with delegates, shaking hands instead of hiding behind furniture. "I signed the pact an hour ago," she said. "Every world, no abstentions. It is the fastest unanimous vote I have witnessed in 11 years of this work." "Good. You could sound more pleased about a result you made possible. I'm pleased the pact passed. I'm less pleased about how it happened." She considered that for a moment, watching me the way she had watched me since the first morning, patient, in a way that respected the shape of another person's limits, though this time she did not let the silence stand quite as long. "Tell me about Quran," she said. "Not the version buried in a classified Dominion file, yours." I did not answer right away, because I had spent years making sure nobody ever asked me that question in a tone that expected an honest answer, and something in her patience had finally worn through the habit of refusing. 31 of us, I said. A garrison posted to a mining outpost nobody important cared about, part of an early trial to see whether human units could hold Concord territory without a larger force backing us up. The Skarn Dominion decided to test that trial with 400 soldiers, because an easy, humiliating loss would have told every frightened border world in the Concord that humanity was not worth the alliance. And instead we held. I was a demolition specialist, young enough to think that was the same thing as being clever, and I found a way to turn the terrain against a force that outnumbered us more than 10 to 1. It worked. We broke that battalion apart from the inside, exactly the way it broke apart today. I paused, because the next part had never gotten easier to say aloud, no matter how many years passed between one telling and the next. 26 of us did not survive winning that fight, including the captain, who trusted my plan enough to give the order, and a friend who stood beside me in the dark until the very end of it. "Silas Bowen," she said quietly, "and Daniel Ashford, Cross found the names in an old service record this afternoon, once your history became rather harder to keep private. Then you already know most of it. I know the facts. I do not know why a man capable of turning back an invasion fleet was working a contract that paid less than the Threxy Vanguard's catering budget. I looked out over the summit hall for a while before I answered that, watching delegates who had nearly died that morning now laughing together over drinks, because that was the thing about surviving something enormous. Life resumed its ordinary shape faster than a person expected it to, even when the person who saved it did not feel nearly so quick to move on. I won that fight at Kharon, I said finally. I have never once been able to convince myself I won it well enough. There were other plans I could have tried. Slower ones, maybe safer ones, that might have gotten more of us out alive even if the battle had taken longer to close. I will never know, because I made the call I made, and 26 people who trusted that call are not here to tell me whether a different one would have saved them instead. That is not a fair weight for one person to carry alone. Fair has very little to do with what a person actually carries, Ambassador. After Kharon, I did not want command again. I did not want to be the one making that kind of call for anyone else, not ever again. Bodyguard work meant protecting exactly one person, with a plan that only had to answer to me if it went wrong. No one else's family, no one else's 26 names. I let out a breath I had been holding longer than I realized. Cheap work suited me. Cheap work meant nobody expected enough from me to ask why I never talked about the years before it. She was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost the careful diplomatic edge she carried through most of our conversations, replaced by something plainer and considerably more direct. For what it is worth, Mr. Voss, I do not think today changes what you deserve to carry. I think it changes what the rest of us understand about the price you have already paid for the chance to carry it quietly. I did not have an answer for that either, but for the first time in longer than I could remember, I did not feel the need to build a wall around the silence that followed. "What will you do now?" Overin asked eventually, when the silence had settled into something comfortable rather than heavy. "The same thing I did yesterday. Stand where I'm told. Notice what other people miss." I considered the question a moment longer than the answer deserved. "It's a good job, Ambassador. Better than most people assume, and better than the version of myself that used to give orders instead of taking them. A smaller job, by most measures. A smaller weight," I said. "That matters more to me than the measure does." Kalik Dorn found us there a short while later, freshly out of the medical bay, with a new brace along one side of his ribs and far less swagger in his stride than he had carried through every hour I had known him before that morning. He stopped a respectful distance away, waited for Overin's small nod of permission, and then crossed the gallery to stand directly in front of me, which was, I would learn, as close as Threxy warrior culture came to standing at attention before someone they respected. "I mocked you," he said, without any preamble. "From the first hour we met, in front of my own soldiers, in front of hers, in front of an entire summit. I called you decoration. I called you charity. I told anyone who would listen that your presence on this contract was an insult to actual security work." He reached into a pouch at his belt and produced a small, worn medallion, the kind of thing I had seen Threxy soldiers wear clipped to their armor, a marker of service rather than decoration. "Among my people, this is given only to those who have stood a doorway that should not have been held, and held it anyway. I have carried mine for 30 years. I would like you to carry one as well." I took it, because refusing would have cost him something I did not think he had left to spare after the day we had both survived. "You didn't have to do this." "No," he agreed. "I did not. I wanted to, which is a different thing, and a good deal more difficult for someone like me to admit out loud." He almost smiled then, the expression sitting strangely on a face built for scowling. "For what it costs me to say it, Voss, you were never the cheap option on this contract. You were simply the only one of us who understood what the job actually required before the job ever demanded it of you." He left after that, back toward the medical bay for a follow-up check the healers had insisted on, and I stood at that railing a while longer with a medallion in my palm that weighed rather more than its size suggested it should. Cross found me once more before his own transfer orders came through, a few weeks later, promoted off Meridian Point to oversee security for a larger relay station nearer the Concorde's inner worlds, a posting he had wanted for years and finally earned, in no small part, because of how his own people had held that day. He did not say much about it, only that he owed me a drink he intended to collect wherever our paths crossed again, and I told him I would hold him to it. Ellery stayed on at Meridian Point, running sensors with markedly more confidence than the young officer who had climbed those gallery stairs 2 at a time on the first morning I met her, and she sent me a short message some months later simply to say that she had stopped needing anyone to double-check her readings before she trusted them herself. The news of what happened at Meridian Point reached the wider Concorde within days, filtered through official reports that used careful, diplomatic language, and through the distinctly less careful accounts delegates carried home to their own worlds. I heard, secondhand, that hiring rates for human security contractors rose sharply across a dozen systems within the following month, though I never once raised my own. One border world, a quiet agricultural system called Doran's Reach that had spent the entire summit undecided about whether the pact was worth the cost to its independence, sent a formal request within the week asking whether human security contractors might be available for hire beyond the terms of the pact itself. I heard about the request the way I heard about most things by then, second-hand, through Cross, who found the whole development quietly amusing in a way he no longer bothered hiding from me. Even the Threxy Vanguard's own leadership sent a formal inquiry to Meridian Point within the month, requesting details of the engagement for what they described as internal review purposes, though Kalik Dorn told me privately he suspected they simply wanted to know whether hiring humans alongside Threxy contracts might become standard practice rather than the cost-saving afterthought it had always been treated as before. Ovren offered me a permanent position on her personal detail before she left Meridian Point, a real contract this time, with real pay attached to it, and I turned it down, gently, because permanent positions come with permanent proximity to rooms full of decisions I had already promised myself I would never make again. She did not push. She simply told me, before her shuttle departed, that the door would remain open for as long as I wanted it to, and I believed her, because she had never once said anything to me since the morning we met that turned out to be less than true. I think about Karan more now than I did before Meridian Point, not because the memory got heavier, but because I finally stopped pretending the weight of it was something I could carry alone forever without anyone else ever noticing the strain. Silas Bowen gave an order he believed in, and it cost him everything. Daniel Ashford stood beside me in the dark and laughed anyway, because that was the kind of person he was, right up until the moment he no longer got to be anything at all. I carry both of them into every job I take now, quietly, the way a person carries the people who shaped him, and I no longer feel the need to pretend that weight does not exist just because nobody else can see it. Humanity's place in the Concorde did not change overnight, not in any way you could point to on a treaty document, but I noticed the small differences all the same. Delegates who had once looked past me in corridors now nodded when we passed. Other security contractors, human and otherwise, mentioned Meridian Point in passing conversation the way soldiers mention a battle everyone already knows the name of, without needing to explain further. Nobody called humanity's rates charity anymore, not where I could hear it, and I suspect not where I could not hear it either. I do not know what it means, exactly, that an entire fleet turned around because of 4 syllables spoken into an open channel. I know only that a name is never really just a name, not once it has been paid for in full, and that the price of mine was set a long time before anyone at that summit ever thought to ask what it was worth. I am still cheap, by the numbers that matter to a contract. I have simply stopped minding what that word actually costs the people who say it about me, because I already know exactly what standing behind it is worth. And so, now, does everyone who was in that chamber the day the invasion stopped at a doorway I chose not to leave.